tall timber. I just want to start with getting all the questions out of the way that you probably get all the time about tall timber. So first of all, why build tall buildings out of timber? What about fire? What about rot? Is it really expensive? Make the case.
I think one of the main kind of cases for tall timber, in my view, is its beauty. And that's what got me actually interested in the idea of being in an environment that actually sort of is inspirational on one level. And I think that for a lot of architects, if you talk to them honestly, that's one of the kind of main kind of draws. But I think with beauty, I think there's also these sort of benefits that sometimes come when you're sort of working with a very sort of renewable and natural resource. And I think one of those is obviously sustainability, in that you're sequestering carbon. Basically trees absorb carbon as they grow, and you're actually taking that carbon that's been absorbed and you're storing it in a building for the life of the building. And then you're also, if you're harvesting that timber from sustainably managed forest, you're actually then going through another cycle where those trees are actually kind of growing again to create another sort of forest that's absorbing more carbon, emitting oxygen. So sustainability is a big thing. I also think like the idea of prefabrication, and then for us, at least in a place like Portland, Oregon, or Oregon in general, which is timber is a huge part of the culture of our state, is this idea of spurring rural economic development. So we're having explosive growth in our cities in Oregon. I think that's very similar around the world, and I think we're also seeing real disparities between what's happening in cities, what's happening in rural areas. And I think we've been really excited about the opportunity to connect, that growth to rural economic development, because in many ways you're building those, buildings in a way in these smaller towns and then assembling them in the city. I think to kind of address your other questions, I mean, fire is a big issue, and it's something we take really seriously. But I think one of the biggest things that people don't necessarily think about when you think about timber buildings, at least in the United States, people think about stick-built houses,
right,
which is very different from the kinds of engineered massive timber buildings that we're talking about. And I think people go to work in large old growth timber warehouses all the time. We're not at all promoting cutting down old trees. What we're trying to do is take the technology we have about how wood can behave, use sort of smaller members and basically laminating them together to create wood that is actually in many ways a higher performing product than many other materials out there. The last question about rot and concerns about that, I think that's a concern with any building. The key is that you maintain the envelope. And I think people don't realize there are buildings in Japan that are 800 years old that are made out of wood.
Wow.
And wood, if it's taken care of, is an incredibly durable material. And I think it's also one of the only materials we have that's renewable. And with all the issues we're having today with climate change, with forest fires, just thinking about how we can actually leverage that material that can actually solve sort of for multiple issues.
Yeah. And you mentioned rural economic development in Oregon specifically, and your firm moved into a new office last year, Albina Yard, that you designed, the first building with domestic timber.
Yeah.
Why did it take this long for us to use domestic timber?
Well, I think the key is that, building with mass timber is not just about architects or owners deciding they want to build using cross-laminated timber. It's also about a supply chain. And up until that point, when D.R. Johnson in Southern Oregon actually installed a cross-laminated timber press, there was really no domestic manufacture of this product. So if you wanted to build out a CLT, you would need to import it. So we were very closely tied to their progress and really trying to say, well, can we actually, in a way, work backwards, look at their supply chain, sort of the size of their press, their capacity, and then design our building around that capacity so that we could actually leverage that product. And I think, there are other structures built out of their CLT. I think what's innovative around ours is that it's the first use of it for a building-wide structural system, the first use of it for a market-rate office building. And we also think that it's a building that actually is in a way driven architecturally by some of the material characteristics of CLT. So one of the kind of key architectural sort of moves behind the building is really the undulating facade, which is an expression of the fact that you can cantilever 4 feet with 4 inches of CLT. It's incredibly stiff. And we wanted to kind of express that material character in the kind of experience of the building on the street.
And how did you do that exactly?
Well, what we did is we did the building's primarily composed of glulam columns and glulam beams, and then we have a very simple floor plate of cross-laminated timber, and we're using the cantilevering potential, the fact that it's a two-way structure, to actually take the wood out of the perimeter walls, so we don't have to worry about that in terms of fire, and then really sort of carefully modulating the cantilever floor to floor, so it goes from almost 2 feet all the way out to 4 feet, and then it reverses, and that's sort of how the facade kind of reads on the street.
Tell me about another one of your projects, Framework.
Yeah.
Describe it first of all, and then how does it incorporate affordable housing? Yeah,
Framework is a really exciting project. It's really a project that's an entire team was responsible for. So we were working with the developer project, the owner of the Land Beneficial State Bank, which is a community development bank, and we put this proposal together for the U.S. Tallwood Building Competition, which some of you may have heard of, but it was really a competition that was sponsored by the USDA and the Softwood Lumber Council to actually provide funding to basically do a high-rise wood building, a building that's not currently in the code. So we had a $1.5 million kind of grant to basically pay for the testing that would demonstrate that this building could perform, like other more traditional building materials. But it wasn't to pay necessarily for the structure itself, but really that differential.
Right.
And the building itself is it's 90,000 square feet. It's 12 stories. It's right in the heart of Portland in the Pearl District, right on a streetcar stop. It's basically ground floor retail for the bank, 5 floors of creative office, and then 5 floors of affordable housing. So it's a pretty complex project. And on top of that, it's also employing what's called a post-tension cross-laminated timber rocking wall system, which is a resilient seismic system. So these seismic systems have been used for buildings around the world. New Zealand is sort of known in some respects. Some of the buildings technology has been related to the work that's been done there. But basically what it is a building that after a major earthquake will actually self-center. So that's also another exciting sort of aspect that's related directly to the wood technology. Yeah,
the west coast of the United States and New Zealand, both seismically active areas. I never thought about timber and seismicity, how they intersect. Are there any inherent benefits to using timber in those environments?
I think there are. I mean, when you think about the fact that wood has a very high strength to weight ratio, so one thing about earthquakes is when something's really heavy, it attracts more force. But wood, by being both strong and light, attracts less force. And it's also relatively flexible. So what we're doing is using some of those sort of basic inherent material characteristics and then really engineering them to create, in a way, you think of like a very, very thick, very stiff, tall shear wall, and then it's basically tension down the center. So the whole wall can rock slightly, but then you have a steel tension rod to pull it back.
Back to something you said earlier about rural economic development. How do you as architects promote that? Because I see how the system of tall timber could be connected to the lumber industry, but I mean, what's the architect's role in that?
I think that it's a complicated question because I think as architects, our job is to kind of connect sort of technologies and sort of movements that are already in the world. And I think that there's definitely an interest in the timber industry, the people that are very close to these communities, of finding new ways to actually make timber a more viable kind of endeavor in, say, a place like rural Oregon. And, I think a lot of that is adding value to that particular material regionally and locally. And what that means is actually thinking of ways where through engineering, through some of the research that's been done, in Oregon and around the world, actually, to create really products that are sort of, basically in a way the building blocks of cities in these rural communities that can actually be then brought easily to a place like Portland. Like what's amazing to me about the Albany Yard and the Framework project is that I believe after Framework was complete, sorry, not Framework, but after Albany Yard was complete, we've had maybe, I would say, 1,000 people come through the building. And I feel that that kind of exposure has given the companies confidence to invest in saying, hey, we're going to actually build up our capacity to actually supply these products for the buildings that we think will happen in the future. So I think it's that kind of spur or catalyst that is important. And Framework is just that type of catalyst, but instead of on more of a regional scale like Albany Yard, it's, I think, more of a national, global scale to say, hey, this is something real, this is something we can get interested in and we can invest in, and then that actually starts the cycle kind of going.
I mostly think of tall timber projects in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and in Vancouver and Canada, British Columbia, areas with, like you said before, a really deep and still very relevant lumber industry, big history of it. Is there interest from elsewhere now? Is it going broader? And if you do have more further afield projects that maybe tall timber is going up in places where they don't have a domestic lumber industry, does the sustainability pitch become less compelling because you have to transport the timber very far?
I think it's interesting that you say that. I think part of the reason I think it's more prevalent in places like the Northwest and Vancouver, BC is that we still have forests, and that haven't necessarily been completely logged. I mean, upper New York State, at a certain point was completely forested, but almost all of it was logged at a certain point. A
lot has come back.
A lot has come back, and I think there's a real opportunity there. I would say, I think you could divide the sort of interest that we have in it to places like North America, and what we're seeing is a real interest in the South, which is also a huge, sort of wood products center, like Alabama and Arkansas. I gave a lecture at Auburn, and the School of Forestry was there, the business school was there, the architecture school, and the engineering school. So they're very interested in thinking about, and there's actually, I think, there's plans to build a CLT plant in Alabama. And there's other sort of plants that are being considered, I think, in Washington State. I do think there's definitely a lot happening in the U.S., and I think that's really, in a way, to kind of catch up with what's been going on in Europe now for quite a long time.
Right.
But I feel like every culture has its own way of creating their products. I mean, I kind of compare where we are with cross-laminated timber to where, say, Oregon was in the wine industry in like 1976. We had a couple people who decided they were going to make some wine, so they made some wine. Other people said, God, this wine seems pretty good.
Right.
If we actually got people that really knew what they were doing, we could make some amazing wine. And now I think you're starting to see people getting interested, just like at that time in the late 70s, the Oregonians brought their wine to France, and the Burgundians are like, wow, this is wine, this is really good. And they went and bought up all the land in Burgundy and then brought that expertise to Oregon. So I think there's that exchange. And then now Oregon is really well known for its wine. It's really well known for its vintners, and it's developing its own kind of tradition.
And it's a vibrant industry now.
Yeah, it's a $1 billion industry.
And you think that's what's going to happen with CLT and tall timber design and manufacturing?
I hope so. I am very optimistic about it. I think it's, and I think tall timber is a small piece of what it will be in my view. I mean, I think it'll be the most visible because everyone's really excited about high rises.
Yeah.
We're really excited about it, but I also think there's this sort of mid-rise, 6 to 8 or 9 stories, which is a huge chunk of what's built, and
Yeah.
I think mass timber and cross-laminated timber will be very important in that sector as well.
One more question. You mentioned being behind Europe. Are there any policy or code changes that the U.S. should adopt, or is there one main thing maybe that we can do to promote more tall timber or more cross-laminated timber?
I don't know if we're so much behind Europe. What I mean by behind is we don't have a robust supply chain. We don't have 14 manufacturers of cross-laminated timber. We don't have a bunch of highly tooled glue laminated timber manufacturers. I mean, the funny thing is so much of the sort of early research on using sort of massive timber structures was done in the United States in like the 40s and 50s, even coming out of like high-rise construction in Chicago. There's an incredible amount of knowledge, but we've sort of forgotten about it in a way. People talk about, you might have heard nail laminated timber as another type of mass timber, which is just basically 2x8s nailed together on its side. My office that was built in the late 30s in Portland was built out of that. It was called car decking. So we used it to park cars on this stuff, in the 30s. So and people are still parking cars on these old buildings that are actually mass timber buildings. So it's just nobody really kind of pays any attention to it because that's what the city of Portland is made out of to a degree. It's made out of these old wood buildings. I think what I think we don't have is that kind of robust supply chain, the sort of that vertical integrated manufacturing that you see in Europe, where you basically design your building on a computer, you order it, and it shows up, and it's ready to put together like a IKEA shelf. That kind of supply chain is going to take time to develop, but I'm very confident it will be developed. It's just a matter of, I think, by who and how quickly and how open source will it be.